Welcome to Craig Back Zone.
So I guess, and this is exciting too, because this is you're my first person that I've interviewed with any kind of law background.
Okay.
So was wondering, what is your understanding of a conservatorship?
Sure. So one really important thing to point out is law is very different from state to state. So I'm only licensed to practice in North Carolina, so I could definitely talk pretty intelligently about what's going on in North Carolina law. California law is just kind of like a fun thing that I've been looking into for the Britney Spears thing. So just take that with a grain of salt. But for what's happening with the conservatorship here is really interesting. So North Carolina has something similar. We call it guardianship here. And essentially what's happening is a third party, usually it'll be like a relative or someone who cares about the person, goes to the court and says, hey, this girl, this guy, whoever it is, can't take care of themselves. They can't perform basic tasks. It's things like, hey, they can't bathe themselves, or they're not feeding themselves, or they're not paying any of their bills on time. They're making really, really irresponsible choices. And this isn't just like, hey, I'm having a rough month. There's something really wrong happening. So with Britney Spears, my understanding of what happened was her father kind of took that role to say to the court, like, hey, look, like she's off the rails. She can't handle herself. She needs somebody else to handle her. But the interesting thing is typically when there's a conservatorship, my understanding, at least in California, is it's a pretty high bar to say this person's completely not able to do what they need to be able to do. And this conservatorship was entered, and then a couple months later, I think, is when she started her Vegas residency. So they're saying to the court, hey, she's not able to perform basic tasks to keep herself alive on her own, but somehow she's able to go and perform in front of millions of people and make millions and millions of dollars that her father's not profiting from. And that's kind of the twist that I'm seeing that I think is pretty horrible and interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been following her forever and still trying to understand all the pieces. And isn't it obviously pretty abnormal for a conservatorship to be placed on someone of younger age?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's to prepare for this, there's a couple great documentaries that have been made now on Hulu and Netflix that talk about that issue. One of the really interesting things is in the initial filing, they had listed, or they had checked the box referring to people who are suffering from like Alzheimer's and dementia. So that's the type of person that is typically subject to these types of things, because it's not that they're not still physically present, but sometimes they're not mentally present. So those are the people who just really will genuinely forget to do basic tasks. So for them to say that Britney Spears, who at the time I think was in her 20s, her 30s, relatively young, to say that she was suffering from those types of symptoms was really strange to me. But of course, I mean, I don't know if they had her evaluated at any point for that. I would assume not, based on what we're seeing now. But typically in that type of a situation, at least in North Carolina, the court would want to see some kind of an evaluation for that, or they would appoint what's called a guardian ad litem, and that's basically an independent. Usually, it's an attorney. I think in North Carolina you might have to be an attorney, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But it's a person whose job is to just represent the person over whom guardianship would be exerted. So in this case, Britney Spears. And that person would go and kind of do a report and figure out exactly what's going on, how much help she needs, and kind of advise the court on what the appropriate next steps are. And from what I've seen so far, I haven't really seen anyone necessarily in that role. She did have a court-appointed attorney, but that person, from what I'm seeing, I know she was very dissatisfied with what that person did. So I don't know the depth to which that person kind of took on that role of really protecting her rights, especially right there in the beginning. I do also think that there's a notice requirement, which is typically when there's a lawsuit filed, you have to notice the other party. You have to let them know that it's going on, and they have a certain amount of time to respond to it. And if I'm remembering correctly, in one of those original filings, they had the judge said that she didn't have that time to respond to it, and the judge just went ahead and made a decision without her having that opportunity. So there's a lot of really weird things happening in this case, that are really unfortunate for her, because it just seems like her rights are being trampled on, which is unfortunate because she's Britney Spears and she's, such a big part of our cultural understanding of like America. I feel like she was such a huge part of, I know, my childhood and my early teenhood. And I think that's true of a lot of people. So it's just sad.
No, absolutely.
Thank you, Katie Black. You're amazing. Thank you,
I
love.
love your energy.
Yes,
I
great
do.
energy.
I love it.
What up?